Hi, welcome back to Not So Obvious Watches. I'm Pete McConville. Firstly, thank you to those people who have sent me DMs and asked if I'm okay. I think that's probably because I've been a bit quiet over the last couple of days. The only thing I'm suffering from is writer's block. I've really been struggling to get my thoughts together on this topic. I've written pages and pages of notes. I've spent hours sitting in front of the camera only to bin it all. So, with no further ado, let's get into the video. What do I want to talk about? Very quickly, I want to talk about the kind of my view of the design, the evolution of the design of the luxury sports watch and how that's evolved since 1972. This video is really part of a series of videos which has been all sort of tapping around the same area. I've been uncomfortable with how we in the watch, particularly the social media side, talk about homages. To the point where I did a whole video about that, to the point where I don't even use that word anymore. I've been uncomfortable with how we in the YouTube community don't take a particularly nuanced view of watch design. And so watches like the Bell & Ross BR05 will get slagged off as cheap knockoffs with some, I sometimes think, deliberate ignorance of how the Bell & Ross design language has grown. And I've seen this again now, I think, with a couple of videos on people talking about the new Chopard Alpine Eagle. In particular, I think Christian over at Theo and Harris referred to it as a Frankenstein watch, and Jory over at the Time Teller managed to talk about this watch for about 9 minutes without once mentioning it was actually derived from another Chopard watch, the Saint Moritz, which I think is actually quite difficult to do. I don't know whether I could talk about that watch for 9 minutes without talking about its predecessor. But before I go on, I should be really clear. I'm not doing this to slag off at Christian or at Jory. I actually like both of those presenters. I watch their videos. They are really emblematic of this kind of lack of nuance that I see, however, in the sort of social media, enthusiast media concept of design. And so with that in mind, I thought I wanted to look at the kind of how the luxury sports watch genre was created, how it was developed, and how, with that background, how we might want to look at the new Chopard Alpine Eagle. And I suppose I'm going to start by doing something quite radical and disagreeing with, or maybe not so much disagreeing with, but de-emphasizing something that Tim Mosso routinely says. One of his little catchphrases is that first is a flag that flies forever. Now, it's not necessarily just his, it's probably come from somewhere else and I can't even be bothered Googling it. But it's something he relies on a lot. And when he talks about watches, he's very insistent on trying to find out who was first to do something. And that's not an uncommon trait. You see that a lot in the watch community, where people try and find the first, and then that becomes the original design, and everything else then just gets collapsed down into this big amorphous mass called homage. One, means the word homage then becomes meaningless, and two, it is simply not a useful way, it's not an accurate way to think about the design process. The other thing is there tends to be this idea that a lot of these classic designs, a lot of these, whether it's the Rolex Submariner, whether it's the Royal Oak, there's a certain mysticism built into the design of these watches, a certain romance that's built into the first example, which is therefore extracted from everything that comes next. The first example of one of these watches is always some romantic story, and therefore elevated, and everything that comes after it is a financially driven decision based upon someone else's romantic vision, and therefore somehow lesser. And I don't think that's true. And if we look at the history of the Royal Oak, you get a real life example of why that's not true. So everything I'm going to say next, I've taken from a Time and Tide article that they ran I think it was a year or so ago. Very short article on the history of the Royal Oak. So I'll keep some links in the show note below. Very quickly, the thumbnail sketch that we all know about the evolution of the Royal Oak is the eve of Baselworld 1972. AP turned to famous watch designer Gerald Genta, asked him to provide a watch design, which he sketches up overnight, provides to them. They put it out on display. It's a slow burner, but becomes one of the great design icons within the watch community and creates a whole new family of watches. That is true. That is how this happened. However, if you read the Time and Tide story and pay a bit more attention to the nuances, those little details that are easy to miss but are very significant, you get a slightly different view of how that happened. So what Time and Tide say is that essentially the bones of what I just said are true, but add a few details. It's the eve of the Baselworld 1972. AP is suffering badly under the effects of the quartz crisis. It's really starting to bite. They need a new seller and they don't know what to do. They get some market research out of Italy, which indicates that there may be an emerging desire for some sort of steel luxury goods, steel luxury watch. AP don't know what to do with it. Their internal designers don't really have anywhere to go with that. So they turn to an outsider and they buy a design. So they commission Gerald Genta to come up with a product to meet the design brief that came from their market research. And then he, with reference to the great zeitgeist that was going on in those early 70s with the emergence of postmodernism that you can see as we moved from like the cars of the mid 60s, all curves and bulbs and romance and organic shapes, into the newer versions of those cars, which were all hard-edged and techno-driven and much more engineering design focused. He picks up on that, he reflects that in his watch, and the Royal Oak is created. And that's an important point to think about the way that design works, because there's no Promethean mystical muse reaching down into AP and giving them this design. There's no divine spark of massive creativity where this design comes out of nowhere and rocks our world. No, the answer to the answer to where did the Royal Oak come from is much more prosaic. A company that needed a new product did some market research, turned to an external designer with a brief to come up with something that kind of matched that, and he gave them a sketch which they rolled out and trialed. That's it. That's the romance of the Royal Oak. None of which actually diminishes the brilliance of the design. The design is a brilliant design. It is by far my favourite Gerald Genta. I think everything after this loses its focus. In particular, the Patek Nautilus I really don't like. I think it's, what I would say is the Royal Oak's a brilliant design. It really captures the zeitgeist of the time. As I said, as we move from the Dino 206 GTS to the Dino 308 GT4, as we move from the Lamborghini Miura to the Lamborghini Countach, and you see the way that design is changing, then you see the Royal Oak is really part of that design change. It's part of that, what's going on in the world. And it's not just in products like cars and watches. Now, using the fairly simplistic kind of first is the flag that flies forever and everything else is a copy, then everything that all the luxury sports watches that came after that are copies. I'm not so sure that's true. If you think about the world of 1972, we didn't have CNC machines and we didn't have an internet, and we didn't have supply chains that could turn on a dime. And so that watches, other luxury sports watches, started emerging within a year of that first introduction, at a time when the Royal Oak itself was still quite controversial. indicates to me that there was probably already some thoughts about creating a luxury sports product at around about that time. And if you think about the 1970s and what was going on in design at that time, it kind of makes sense. And also, if you look at what came next in that space, you see a lot of the motifs that were in the Royal Oak get continued, probably because other companies' market research was saying something similar, but they also played with some other ideas. I'll walk through very briefly, some of the other things that came out very quickly, like in the few years after we first saw the Royal Oak. So first off, we had Piaget with its Polo at the time, and that picked up a lot of the ideas of the Royal Oak in terms of shapes and the use of an integrated bracelet. But on the other hand, it went in a different direction, didn't pick up steel, it went with a lot of precious metals. And also, again, it picking up in the zeitgeist at the time, it actually dropped the base caliber that was the JLC caliber that AP used, and they went for a quartz movement. Sticking with a similar theme, Girard Perregaux, which with its Laureato, is roundly pilloried for the fact that it blatantly copied the AP, which in some senses it did. The shapes are very, very similar. But then it went for a two-tone model, it went for a two-tone materials, and went hardcore on a completely in-house quartz movement in 1972. So, one, I find it difficult to believe that in 1972 they developed a quartz movement, developed a case, and put all that out on a dime, that they spun from seeing this thing at Baselworld, suddenly they were able to produce it. I suspect that they had something in mind for some time. They were probably basing it around that new quartz movement they were building for some time. And all that the Royal Oak did was perhaps influence some of the shaping of that watch. Cartier did something really interesting in response to the Royal Oak. They actually reached back into their archives and picked up their old design, the Santos, and I would guess in response to the Royal Oak, exaggerated some features it had always had. It had always been a square watch. It had always had visible fasteners. But suddenly the version that came out in the 70s, those fasteners became much bigger, very reminiscent of the Royal Oak, and really picking up again on what's going on in that segment, and using their design language but importing a couple of tropes that other companies were building on into their watch. You had, and the most famous of all of them would have been obviously Patek Philippe with the Nautilus. Now they didn't have, for whatever reason, they couldn't, they didn't want to. For whatever reason, they didn't try and develop something in-house like AP. They went outside and they got the same guy, Gerald Genta, to come in and continue that design path, that design evolution, and came up with the Nautilus. Frankly, not my favourite watch, but that's what they did. And on top of that, you also had, I left out, you also had VC, so Vacheron Constantin did something similar. They came out, they did something interesting. They picked up this idea of the luxury sports watch. They doubled down on the steel side of it, but they also did some really different things with the design of that watch, that first watch, the 222, which didn't last very long and then was subsequently replaced by the Overseas, which again picks up on almost all of the basic specifications of the Royal Oak. Steel, oversized, automatic caliber, integrated bracelet, hard-edged machine type finishing, but some quite different shaping, and they picked up a different motif. They didn't go so much with the exposed screws, but instead adapted their Maltese cross branding to become sort of a feature that they could incorporate into their design. Now, all of those watches, and there would have been more, but they're the only ones I found very quickly in my research. Then in 1980, Chopard joined the queue, and they do pretty much the same as everyone else. Now, Chopard did not have much of a watch history at all. In fact, I think the Saint-Moritz may have been one of their very first wristwatches. But if you look at the Saint-Moritz, it really just picks up on all of what has now been established as the normal tropes of that design. Overall, the design of the Saint-Moritz is fairly unremarkable and probably suffers quite badly from coming late in the design cycle of that genre. Now, personally, I don't really like the design of the original Saint-Moritz. I think it's classic 1980s, and it really suffers for it. It's just too much. It doesn't capture that sense of sportiness that the originals had, and instead probably goes a bit too far down the luxury line. But apparently it was quite successful and ran for quite a few years. Fast forward 30 years, and that luxury sports watch market has continued to be really popular. If anything, though, there's certain trends which have hardened within that. So there's been overall an emphasis on steel. So across the board, you will see most of those early watches, many of which came out in two tones and gold and precious metals, many of those have now developed steel versions. The other thing you would notice is that across the board, the resurgence of, particularly with the resurgence of the Swiss luxury watch market in general, and the focus upon their unique selling point of this artisanship and mechanical watches, those early experiments with luxury quartz watches have by and large been dropped. And so whether it's now the Piaget or the Girard Perregaux or any other, those watches have all pretty much now become mechanical. But that's the market now. That is the segment. It's almost near as damn it 50 years since the Royal Oak emerged from its market research, and we first saw it. And now what you have is a well-established segment of watches with a particular theme, which you can write fairly neatly in a spec sheet. That would be generally steel, mechanical, integrated bracelet, sporty tones, sporty feel, very high production values, normally some interesting mixes of shapes, almost always going to be a mix of hard edges and softer curves to try and create some sort of tension in the design. Yeah, that's basically it. That is what it is. That is what a luxury steel watch is. So whether you're talking about a Nautilus, an Aquanaut, a Royal Oak, an Offshore, Bell & Ross, that's just the design language. Which brings us to the Chopard Alpine Eagle. Is it a Franken watch? A mindless mashup of other watches, lesser than them, merely copying what they've done before? I don't think so. Is it a lazy design inspired purely by market research, built incorporating a bunch of sometimes tropes, perhaps even cliches within the market? Yeah, that's possibly true, but then on the other hand, that is kind of the definition of building a watch within a class. You could level exactly the same criticism at pretty much every dive watch. You could level the same criticism at every pilot's watch. That's kind of what it takes to build something within a class. If you didn't follow the tropes of that design class, you're not in that design class. And so what does that mean? What does all of those words mean when we look at a design like the BR05, or we look at a design like the Chopard Alpine Eagle? I think what it means is we take all of our ideas about first is the flag, first is the flag that flies forever, and these romantic ideas that someone else had some great artistic divine spark, but this is just a purely commercial, money grab, and we just bin all of those. We might give the Royal Oak a couple of little pats on the head for congratulations, you seem to be one of the first ones, and out of that you have the most focused design and it's a really classic shape. Great, well done. But everyone else doesn't necessarily become a lesser watch merely because it came second. It's really just now, rather than trying to assess the design by how much have you taken from someone else's design, perhaps we should be asking ourselves, how successfully have you taken from someone else's design? How successfully have you taken those general rules of the design class? How successfully have you taken the idea of steel, integrated bracelet, exposed screws, all of those other things, and turned it into your watch? And that's really at the heart of what I was talking about with the Bell & Ross BR05. I didn't really have a problem with the fact that it was representative of its design class because it's trying to be representative of its design class. My concern with that watch is I'm not sure how successfully it carried off the tropes, how successfully it incorporated the design features of a luxury sports watch. And my view of the Chopard is the same. I think we are doing ourselves a disservice. We are showing that we don't understand design if we slag it off purely on the basis that it conforms to the tropes of that design class. Rather, we should be looking at it more deeply and saying, how successfully does it conform to those design rules? How successfully does it play with those rules and create something new? Or, conversely, how unsuccessfully does it? And so with that said, I'm not going to try and review the Alpine Eagle now. I've spoken way too much and I've said far too many words, and I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to edit this into something that's meaningful and short like I think I promised you. To summarize all this, what I've tried to do is look at how a class of watch develops, how almost always that class of watch develops from a crude commercial desire to sell a watch driven by market research, and that whatever drove that first watch is not significantly more artistic, not significantly more original than the watches that come afterwards. That we shouldn't judge the watches that come afterwards just by how much they took from the rules of the new rules of the game, but rather by how successfully they play those rules. If we can do that, if we can take a more nuanced view of how does design work, how do people come up with these ideas, how do design classes and design ideas emerge, how do we figure out, how do we talk about how well a design does or doesn't play within that space? If we can have those discussions, we will enjoy our watches more, we will have far more watches to look at, we will have far greater scope to play in this space. I think one of the great problems with the marketplace, I think one of the great problems that we have in this hobby of horology is that we focus on these simple things like the watch, the brand, the model, the one that came first, that our interest gets focused down really tightly to a very narrow scope of watches on the basis, well, they were the first, therefore they're the OG, therefore they're the only ones worth looking at. And we exclude all of these magnificent and often far better articulations of those ideas purely because they happen to come a little bit later. And with that said, I'm just going to stop this video. I haven't tried to reach a conclusion. I haven't tried to say anything particularly definitive. This whole video is really just about throwing ideas out, inviting people to think about watches and watch designs in new ways. On top of that, I should really add, I don't particularly like the new Chopard. It doesn't appeal to me that much. But maybe if I dig into it, I'll find something for it. So just in case any of you think I'm necessarily defending this watch because it's really high on my list of things to buy, it's probably not. But I still think we should be fair in how we think about it. I've been Pete McConville. This has been Not So Obvious Watches. This has been me going on a long stream of consciousness, and I hope I can get something decent out of the edit. If you like this, if you like my slightly different view of looking at watch designs, watch industry, watch media, how this whole thing works, please subscribe to my channel. You'll get a lot more of this. Hopefully better focused, bit less all over the place. If you hang on for a second, a card will come up. It's got my contact details, so get in contact with me if you're interested. Quick one, watch check. I don't normally remember, but I will today. Today I'm wearing my Alpina Star Timer Pilot Automatic. In some ways the watch that got me into collecting, but that's a whole story for another day. See you later. Bye.